Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The photographs were still wet. Robert Fitzgerald found them hanging from a low branch on the Hall of Moss's trail, clipped to a length of fishing line like prints developing in a darkroom. Water beaded on their glossy surfaces, dripping onto the moss below in a rhythm that didn't match the rainfall that had stopped 3 hours ago. 4 Polaroids, the old kind that didn't exist anymore except in thrift stores and nostalgia. He'd been a ranger at Olympic National Park for 12 years, and in that time he'd seen plenty of strange things left behind by hikers: prayer flags, cremated remains, painted rocks with messages. But never this. Never photographs that couldn't have been taken where they hung because the angle was wrong. Because the perspective showed the exact spot where he was standing. Taken from a position 15 feet above the forest floor where no platform existed, the first photo showed the trail marker he'd passed 10 minutes ago. The second showed the suspension bridge over Willoughby Creek, its cables silvered with morning mist. The third showed his own truck parked at the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center, license plate visible, taken yesterday morning. He knew it was yesterday because he remembered the coffee cup on the dashboard, the one he'd forgotten and found dried out when he returned at shift's end. The fourth photograph showed Olivia Rhodes. Robert's hands began to shake. The paper crinkled under his grip, water soaking into his gloves. Olivia Rhodes had been missing for 6 days. Her last known location was the Hoh River Trail, approximately 4 miles from where he stood. She'd been hiking alone, something the Park Service advised against but couldn't prevent. 26 years old, marine biology graduate student from Seattle, researching old-growth forest ecosystems. The photo showed her sitting on a nurse log, arms wrapped around her knees, staring directly at the camera with an expression Robert had seen before, in his nightmares, in the mirror during the bad months after David died. It was the expression of someone who knew they were already gone. He'd been the one to find David's body 3 years ago in Mount Rainier National Park, after the fall that shouldn't have killed him, except David had been climbing alone despite protocol, except Robert had been the one who was supposed to go with him that day and called in sick with a hangover he was too ashamed to admit. David had lain at the bottom of that crevasse for 18 hours before Robert found him, and in that time something had changed in David's face, a knowledge written in the frozen muscles that Robert couldn't articulate but recognized on a level deeper than conscious thought. The certainty of death arriving early, settling into features still technically alive. Olivia Rhodes wore that same expression. Robert pulled out his radio, then stopped. What would he report? That he found impossible photographs hanging from a tree. That one of them showed the missing woman everyone was searching for but offered no clue about where she actually was? He'd already been on psychiatric leave once. His supervisor, Margaret Vance, had been understanding but firm. One more episode and he'd be doing desk work permanently. The Park Service didn't take chances with rangers who saw things that weren't there, who woke up screaming in the bunkhouse, who requested transfers away from their assigned sectors because the trees felt wrong. He pocketed the photographs and continued down the trail. The Hoh Rainforest was a temperate rainforest that received over 12 feet of rain annually, creating a landscape unlike anywhere else in the continental United States. Sitka spruce and western hemlock grew to massive proportions, their trunks draped in club moss and hanging gardens of ferns. The canopy was so dense that the forest floor existed in permanent twilight, even at noon. Sound behaved strangely here, muffled by the vegetation bouncing off wet bark in unexpected directions, creating echoes where none should exist. Robert had always loved this forest before David, before the night terrors, before he'd started seeing David's face in the patterns of lichen on tree trunks. Now it felt like a throat slowly closing. The trail wound through a gallery of giants, trees that had been ancient when the Mayflower landed. The Hoh people, the indigenous tribe for whom the river was named, had stories about this forest, about spirits that lived in the oldest trees, about paths that appeared and disappeared, about the dead who walked on moonless nights. Robert had attended a cultural sensitivity training where an elder had spoken about these traditions. and he'd listened politely while planning his grocery list in his head. He'd been a man of science then, someone who understood hypothermia and dehydration and the statistical likelihood of hikers making fatal mistakes. He'd believed the forest was dangerous only in the ways that mountains and rivers were dangerous, through indifference rather than intention. That was before David's autopsy report came back with findings that made no sense. Abrasions that predated the fall, traces of plant matter in his lungs from species that didn't grow at that elevation, and a core body temperature taken 3 hours after death that was 15 degrees lower than it should have been. The medical examiner had noted these anomalies and then filed them under inconclusive environmental factors. Because what else could she do? Robert had read the report 17 times, memorizing every impossible detail, until his therapist had gently taken it away and told him that searching for meaning in tragedy only created more pain. But he'd kept searching anyway. His radio crackled. "Fitzgerald, you copy?" Margaret's voice, professional and clipped. Robert unclipped the radio from his belt. "Copy. We've got another witness report. Hiker claims they saw a woman matching Rhodes's description near the Blue Glacier Trail junction yesterday evening. Can you sweep that sector?" The Blue Glacier Trail junction was 9 miles away, in the opposite direction. "That's outside my assignment today. Jackson called in sick. You're closest." A pause. "You okay handling this?" The question beneath the question. "Are you stable enough to handle a search for a missing woman, given your history?" "I'm fine," Robert said. "Heading there now." He turned back the way he'd come, and that's when he noticed the tree. It was a Sitka spruce, maybe 200 feet tall, its trunk 8 feet in diameter. He'd passed it on the way in. He was certain he'd passed it, because there was a distinctive burl on the left side, shaped like a human face in profile, except now the burl was on the right side, or he'd gotten turned around, or the forest was denser than he remembered, the path narrower, the light different. Robert pulled out his Garmin GPS unit and checked his location. The device took longer than usual to acquire satellites, the screen flickering. When it finally stabilized, it showed his position as 40 feet west of the trail. That was impossible. He was standing on the trail. He could see the wooden boardwalk sections installed to protect sensitive vegetation. He could see his own boot prints in the mud from 20 minutes ago. The GPS showed him in the middle of unmarked forest. He looked up from the screen. The trail was still there. But when he looked at the GPS again, his position hadn't changed. 40 feet west, in an area the map designated as impassable old growth. Robert turned off the GPS and turned it back on. Same result. He tried his radio. "Vance, I'm having equipment issues. My GPS is showing incorrect positioning." Static answered him. Heavy, textured static that sounded almost like breathing. "Vance, do you copy?" More static. Then, cutting through it, a voice. Not Margaret's. A woman's voice, speaking in a language Robert didn't recognize, syllables that rose and fell like water over stone. Japanese, maybe? Or something older. The voice continued for 5 seconds, then cut off abruptly, replaced by silence so complete that Robert realized he couldn't hear anything. No birds. No wind. No distant murmur of the Ho River. The forest had gone completely, impossibly quiet. He'd experienced this once before, at Mount Rainier, in the hours before he found David. This same suffocating silence, as if the world had been wrapped in cotton, as if he'd gone deaf, but could still hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Robert started walking fast, then jogging, following the trail markers even though his GPS claimed he was moving through solid forest. His breath came harsh and ragged. The photographs in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, accompanied by a sound like wet fabric dragging across wood. He didn't look back. Looking back was how people died in these situations. He'd read the reports, the ones that never made it into official files but got passed around among rangers late at night. Stories of hikers who'd felt watched and turned around to see something standing between the trees. Stories of people who'd heard their names called in familiar voices and followed the sound-off trail. Stories of bodies found in impossible positions, in places no human could have reached, wearing expressions of terminal horror. The footsteps kept pace with him, never closer, never farther away. Robert broke into a full run. The trail twisted and rose, crossing a small creek on a log bridge. He pounded across it, his boots thudding on the wet wood. The footsteps behind him didn't change rhythm. They maintained that same measured pace, unhurried, inevitable. He burst into a clearing he didn't recognize. No, not a clearing, a campsite. There were the remains of a fire, carefully constructed with a rock ring. A tent, blue and orange, its rain flies secured against weather. A backpack leaning against a tree, brand name visible. Osprey Atmos 65. Everything neat and organized, the way an experienced hiker would leave a camp when going for a short day hike. Everything except that the tent fabric was wrong. It was moldy, degraded, the color faded in a way that suggested months or years, not days. Robert approached slowly. His heart was still racing, but the footsteps had stopped when he entered the clearing. The tent's zipper was closed. He knew he shouldn't open it. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, to radio for support, to wait for daylight and backup, even though it was already noon. He opened it anyway. The smell hit him first, decay and something sweeter, like incense. The tent's interior was empty, except for a sleeping bag and a small pile of belongings. A journal, its pages swollen with moisture, a Washington State driver's license in a clear plastic case. Robert picked it up with shaking hands. Olivia Rhodes smiled at him from the photo, her expression nothing like the knowledge-haunted look from the Polaroid. This was a DMV photo, taken in boredom and mild irritation, the smile perfunctory. Date of birth, April 3rd, 1985. He did the math. She'd turned 26 3 months ago. Robert opened the journal. The first entry was dated 6 months ago. The handwriting was careful and precise. The words those of a scientist documenting observations. Olivia had been studying nitrogen cycling in old-growth forests, collecting soil samples, measuring rainfall, tracking decomposition rates. The entries were mundane until he reached one dated 2 weeks ago. Something's wrong with the North Grove. The trees are dying, but the leaves are still green. Found a circle of stones that doesn't match any historical documentation of Ho settlements. Doctor, Matsumoto would find this fascinating. It looks like a kamidana, but why would there be a Shinto shrine this deep in the forest? The stones are covered in offerings, coins, flowers, origami cranes, all of them recent. The next entry was 1 week ago. I keep hearing singing at night, a woman's voice. I don't know the language, but it makes me feel cold inside, like the sound is pulling heat from my body. I found more offerings today. Someone's been maintaining this shrine. I took photographs, but they came out wrong, overexposed as if there's a light source I can't see. 5 days ago. I saw her last night. A woman in white. She was standing at the edge of my tent, not moving, just standing there. I could see her shadow through the fabric. When I opened the tent, she was gone, but there were wet footprints leading into the forest. I followed them. I shouldn't have followed them, but I did. They led to the shrine. There was fresh blood on the stones. 4 days ago, the last entry. She's angry. I don't know how I know this, but I can feel it. Something terrible happened here. Something that hasn't been forgiven. I need to leave, but I can't find the trail. My GPS keeps showing me in different locations. The maps don't match the terrain. I'm walking in circles. I tried to reach the ranger station, but my radio only picks up that voice, singing the same song over and over. I think I'm going to die here. I think she wants me to die here. I look like someone she hates. I saw my reflection in the river yesterday, and for just a moment it wasn't my face. It was an Asian woman's face, older, with hair down to her waist. When I blinked, I was myself again. But she's in my head now. I can feel her. The journal ended there. Robert set it down carefully and backed out of the tent. The clearing was still silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just that oppressive, waiting silence. He pulled out his radio again and tried to call for help, but all he got was static, and that voice singing in Japanese. the melody rising and falling like a lament. He pulled out the Polaroid of Olivia and looked at it again. In the photograph, she was staring at something off camera, her expression frozen in recognition of something awful. Robert tilted the photo, trying to see what she was looking at, and that's when he noticed the shadow. There was a shadow on the ground beside Olivia in the photograph, a human shadow. But Olivia was alone in the frame. The shadow was too tall, too thin, with hair that pooled on the ground like spilled ink. Robert's hands went numb. The photograph fell into the mud. Behind him, someone whispered his name. Not his ranger name, not his professional identity, but the name David had called him in private, the nickname only one person in the world had used. He spun around. The clearing was empty, but now he could see what he'd missed before. Scratches on the trees surrounding the campsite, symbols carved deep into the bark. Japanese characters, he thought, but degraded, violent, hacked into the wood with something that left ragged edges. The trees were bleeding sap from the wounds, fresh and sticky. And there, at the edge of the clearing, barely visible between two massive hemlocks, stood a figure in white. Robert froze. The figure was tall and thin, wearing what might have been a kimono or burial shroud. Her hair hung down to her waist, black and wet, obscuring her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there, but Robert could feel her attention on him like physical pressure, crushing the air from his lungs. She took a step forward. Her feet made no sound on the forest floor. Robert backed away, his hand fumbling for the canister of bear spray on his belt, even though he knew it would be useless. Another step. The woman's hair swayed, though there was no wind. He could see her hands now, pale and long-fingered, hanging at her sides. "I'm sorry," Robert heard himself say. "Whatever happened here, I'm sorry." The figure tilted her head, a movement too smooth, too controlled. When she spoke, her voice was the same one from the radio, syllables flowing like water, like mourning, like rage given sound. Robert didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. "You are not forgiven. You will never be forgiven. This place remembers." She raised one hand and pointed at him. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Robert's breath misted in front of his face. Ice crystals formed on the tense rainfly, crackling as they spread. The trees groaned, their trunks contracting in the sudden cold. And Robert saw with horrible clarity what had happened here. Not a vision, not exactly. More like a memory that wasn't his own, downloaded directly into his consciousness. A Japanese woman, early 20th century, living in a logging camp when Japanese immigrants worked the Olympic Peninsula forests. Her name was Yuki. She'd married a white foreman who'd promised her safety, promised her a home, promised her dignity. Instead, he'd betrayed her, publicly humiliated her, and when she'd threatened to leave, when she'd threatened to expose his financial crimes, he'd killed her. Not quickly. He'd brought her to this grove, tied her to a tree and left her to die slowly over 3 days while the forest bore witness. She'd died hating him, died cursing him, died swearing that she would never leave, that her rage would saturate this ground, that anyone who reminded her of her suffering would share it. And Olivia Rhodes, with her Asian features, her black hair, her presence in this grove, Olivia had become the target of a century of rage. Robert understood now. The shrine Olivia had found wasn't a kamedana. It was a warning, offerings left by someone who knew this forest's history, trying to appease an onryo, a vengeful spirit, trying to prevent exactly what had happened. The woman in white took another step forward. She was 10 feet away now. Close enough that Robert could see beneath the wet hair, could see that her face was wrong, was incomplete, was showing bone through translucent skin. Close enough that he could smell earth and rotting flowers. "Where is she?" Robert forced the words out. "Where's Olivia?" The spirit's head tilted further, impossibly far. When she spoke again, her voice was layered, multiple voices speaking in harmony, all of them filled with anguish and fury. The words shifted, becoming English. becoming something Robert could understand. She walks. She walks as I walked. She dies as I died. She becomes what I became. No, Robert said. No, that's not, you can't. But the spirit was pointing now, pointing past him, deeper into the forest. Robert turned, following the gesture, and saw what she wanted him to see. A figure was walking through the trees, moving with the same measured, inexorable pace as the footsteps he'd heard earlier. The figure wore a Park Service uniform, carried a radio and GPS unit, looked exactly like Robert Fitzgerald, except that its eyes were empty holes and its mouth hung open in a scream that never ended. Robert watched himself walk past, dead but still moving, trapped in an eternal loop of searching for something that could never be found. He saw David standing behind a tree, his body broken from the fall, but still walking, still looking for the partner who'd abandoned him. He saw other rangers, other hikers, all of them caught in this place, all of them victims of their own guilt and the forest's long memory. The spirit's voice came again, softer now, almost gentle. You feel her, the one you failed. You carry him, the one you abandoned. This forest keeps such things, this forest never forgets. Robert fell to his knees. The cold was absolute now, burning his exposed skin. His thoughts were fragmenting, his sense of self dissolving. He could feel David's presence not as memory but as tangible weight, the accusation of his death wrapping around Robert's throat like hands. I'm sorry, Robert whispered. David, I'm so sorry. The spirit crouched before him, her movement fluid and terrible. Up close he could see that her burial shroud was rotting, could see the rope marks on her wrists from where she'd been bound to the tree, could see the hatred in what remained of her eyes. But when she touched his face, her hand was surprisingly gentle. You did not kill him, she said, her English perfect now, almost kind. But you carry his death, as I carry mine, as she carries hers. This forest is built on such carrying, on grief that has nowhere to go, on rage that cannot be satisfied, on guilt that eats and never fills. Her fingers were ice against his skin. Robert could feel his heartbeat slowing, his body temperature dropping, his consciousness beginning to fade. Let me show you where she waits, the spirit whispered. Let me show you what you came here to find. The world inverted. Robert was standing. No, he was walking. No, he was everywhere at once, his consciousness stretched thin across the forest like morning fog. He saw through the trees' perspective, felt their roots drinking from soil mixed with human remains, tasted the memories stored in moss that had absorbed a century of decay. The forest was alive in a way he'd never understood, a vast, interconnected network of consciousness that remembered everything that happened within its boundaries. And there, at the heart of it, was Olivia Rhodes. She was standing in a grove he'd never seen before, though his GPS would probably claim it didn't exist. The trees here were different, twisted, their trunks spiraling in patterns that hurt to perceive. And in the center of the grove, the shrine Olivia had written about. Not a Shinto shrine, a containment, a prison, a place where someone long ago had tried to bind Yuki's spirit and failed. Olivia was standing before it, her back to Robert, her Park Service uniform torn and muddy. She'd been here for days, maybe longer, walking in circles around the shrine, following the same path over and over. When she turned, Robert saw that her face was no longer entirely her own. Yuki's features were bleeding through, the spirit's rage wearing Olivia's body like an ill-fitting mask. Help me, Olivia said, but the voice was layered, two women speaking at once. Robert tried to move toward her and found he couldn't. He was back in his own body, back in the clearing, the spirit still crouched before him with her hand on his face. Frost was forming where she touched him, ice crystals spreading across his cheek. You cannot save her, Yuki said. She is already mine. She carries the face of those who looked away when I screamed. She carries the silence of those who knew and did nothing. She will walk here forever as I walked until someone pays the debt. What debt? Robert's voice was barely a whisper. What do you want? The spirit's expression changed. The hatred flickered, revealing something underneath. Not mercy, but a kind of terrible understanding. I want what was taken. I want justice. I want recognition. I want the man who killed me to be punished, but he died 80 years ago in his sleep, unpunished, unmourned by anyone who knew the truth. I want time to reverse. I want my life returned. I want the impossible. She released his face and stood. And so I take what I can. I take the guilty. I take those who carry death on their souls. I take those who look like me, sound like me, remind me of what I was. I take, and it never fills the emptiness. Robert struggled to his feet. His legs barely supported him. Then stop. Choose to stop. You don't have to. I do not choose. The spirit's voice rose to a shriek that made the trees shudder. I am what was made of me. I am rage given form. I am the price of being forgotten. The forest erupted with sound. Birds burst from branches in panic. Small animals fled in waves. The ground itself seemed to pulse with anger. And Robert understood finally what he was dealing with. Not a ghost. Not really. Not a conscious entity making decisions. Yuki had been dead so long that she was no longer a person. She was a force, a phenomenon. Grief and fury calcified into something that could only repeat and consume. But Olivia wasn't gone yet. Olivia was still alive, still trapped, still fighting. Robert pulled out his radio one more time. Vance, if you can hear me, I need backup at... He checked his GPS, but the screen was solid ice now, cracked and useless. I'm in the North Grove, beyond the Hall of Mosses trail. I found Rhodes. She's alive, but in critical condition. I need medical evac, and... Static drowned him out. But this time, instead of Yuki's voice, he heard something else. A helicopter, distant but real, responding to some earlier call. Hope surged in his chest. Yuki's spirit turned toward the sound, her head tilting, sensing the approach of the living world. For just a moment, her form wavered, becoming less solid. Robert ran. He didn't know which direction he was going, just away from the clearing, toward the helicopter sound. The forest tried to stop him. Branches snagged his clothes, roots materialized underfoot. The path twisted back on itself, but he kept running, driven by pure animal panic and something else. Something he'd lost 3 years ago when David died. The belief that saving someone might save himself. Behind him, Yuki shrieked. The sound was everywhere, resonating from every tree, a wail of abandonment and fury. Robert felt her attention focus on him like a searchlight, burning cold, pulling heat from his body. He burst through a wall of ferns and found himself on a trail he recognized, the main route, marked with official Park Service signs. He was back in the real forest, the one that operated by natural laws. Behind him, deeper in the trees, he could hear the helicopter getting closer. His radio crackled. "Fitzgerald, respond, we have your last known position." "I'm here," Robert shouted into the radio. "North Grove, I found Rhodes's camp. She's still in there, but there's..." He stopped. What could he say? That there was a vengeful ghost? That the forest itself was hostile? That Olivia was being possessed by a woman who died in 1923? "There's something wrong with her mental state," he said instead. "Possible exposure, hypothermia, psychological break. She's not alone in there." He meant Yuki, but it could be interpreted as another person. "Request immediate extraction and medical support." "Copy that, Fitzgerald. Helo is 2 minutes out. Light a flare if you can mark the position." Robert pulled a flare from his pack and lit it, the red smoke billowing up through the canopy. The helicopter circled overhead, rotors thudding. It couldn't land in the dense forest, but it could drop a rescue team. Robert ran back toward the grove. He had 2 minutes, maybe less, to find Olivia and get her to the extraction point. He followed his own trail back through the ferns, back through the twisting path, back to the clearing where Olivia's tent sat rotting. Yuki was there, waiting. But now Robert could see her more clearly, could see the woman beneath the rage. She'd been young when she died, maybe 30. She'd had a life, had dreams, had loved someone before betrayal and murder twisted her into this thing. The hatred in her eyes was real, but so was the sorrow underneath. "I can't give you justice," Robert said. "I can't give you your life back. but I can acknowledge what happened to you. I can make sure you're not forgotten." The spirit regarded him silently. "Tell me," Robert said. "Tell me your story. Your real name, not just Yuki. Where you came from, what you loved, what you lost. Tell me and I'll make sure it's recorded. I'll make sure the Park Service knows this grove's history. I'll make sure you're not just a warning in a journal, not just a ghost story. I'll make sure you were real." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the spirit's form began to change. The rage drained from her features, leaving only exhaustion. When she spoke, her voice was human again, tired and infinitely sad. "Tanaka Yukiko. I came from Hiroshima in 1919. I loved poetry and the ocean. I lost everything when I trusted a man who saw me as less than human. I died alone in pain, calling for help that never came. I was 28 years old." "I'm sorry," Robert said. "I'm so sorry that happened to you." Tanaka Yukiko nodded slowly. "Your friend, David, he did not blame you. He knew you carried guilt you did not earn. He wants you to know that." Robert's eyes burned with tears he'd been holding for 3 years. "Is he here? Can I—" "He was never here. He left cleanly, without rage to bind him. What you saw was only your guilt, given form by this place. I showed you your fear, not his truth." She paused. "I am sorry for that. I hurt from hurting others. But I cannot stop. The rope around my wrists, the betrayal in my heart. These things have no ending." The helicopter was directly overhead now. Robert heard shouting, saw figures rappelling down through the canopy. "Where is she?" Robert asked. "Where's Olivia?" Tanaka Yukiko pointed deeper into the forest. "She walks where I walked. She follows the path I made in dying. But she is not dead yet. There is still time." Robert ran. The forest opened before him now, the path clear, as if Yukiko was showing him the way. He burst into the shrine grove and found Olivia walking in circles, her eyes distant, her lips moving in silent repetition of words she didn't understand. She was freezing, hypothermic, her skin gray. Robert grabbed her, breaking the pattern of her walking. Olivia collapsed into his arms, her body temperature shocking in its coldness. He stripped off his jacket and wrapped it around her, lifting her in a fireman's carry. She weighed almost nothing, as if the ghost had been draining her substance as well as her will. The rescue team found him halfway back to the extraction point. They took Olivia from him, checking vitals, starting emergency warming protocols. Someone was talking to him, but Robert couldn't hear them over the sound of his own heartbeat. He turned back toward the grove one last time. Tanaka Yukiko stood at the edge of the trees watching. As Robert looked, she bowed, a formal, respectful bow, and then faded like morning mist, dissolving into the forest that had been her prison and tomb for nearly a century. The helicopter lifted off, Olivia strapped to a stretcher, Robert and 2 SAR members riding back toward civilization. Below them, the whole rainforest stretched out in every direction, green and ancient and full of secrets. 3 weeks later, Robert stood in Margaret Vance's office at park headquarters. "Olivia Rhodes is recovering," Margaret said. "Physically, anyway. She's got some frostbite damage and significant weight loss, but she'll survive. Psychologically," she shook her head, "she doesn't remember most of what happened. Says the last clear memory she has is setting up her tent 6 days before we found her. Everything after that is fragments. She keeps talking about cold and singing and someone who wanted her to stay." Robert nodded. He'd written his report carefully, documenting the tent, the journal, the hypothermia. He'd left out the impossible parts, the ghost, the supernatural cold, the visions, but he'd included something else. "I've been researching the grove where we found her camp," Robert said. "There's an incident from 1923 that didn't make it into official records. A Japanese woman named Tanaka Yukiko who disappeared in that area. Her body was never found. I think we should install a memorial, something that acknowledges what happened there." Margaret studied him. "Based on what evidence?" "Local historical society has records, newspaper clippings. It happened. Robert met her eyes. Someone should remember her. And you think this will help Rhodes recover? Knowing the history? I think it matters, Robert said. I think the forest remembers things we've forgotten. I think acknowledging that is part of respecting the land we're supposed to protect. Margaret was quiet for a long time. You're different, Fitzgerald, since you came back from that search. More settled somehow. Robert thought about David, about the 3 years he'd spent haunted by guilt that wasn't his to carry. He thought about Tanaka Yukiko, trapped by rage she couldn't release. He thought about the forest's long memory and the weight of things left unsaid. I think I understand something now, he said, about letting go, about forgiveness, about the difference between honoring the dead and being consumed by them. Margaret nodded slowly. I'll look into the memorial. But Fitzgerald, if you ever feel like you're losing it again, if the forest starts feeling wrong, if you're seeing things, you come talk to me, immediately. No heroics. Understood? Understood. Robert left her office and walked out into the October afternoon. The sun was setting early now, autumn turning toward winter. He had a shift starting tomorrow, back in the backcountry, back to the trails and the ancient trees, and the silence that was sometimes just silence and sometimes something more. But tonight, he was going home to his small apartment in Forks, where he'd cook dinner and maybe call his sister, who he hadn't talked to in 6 months. He'd write in the journal his therapist had suggested, documenting not the horrors but the ordinary moments, the ones worth living for. He'd sleep, and maybe he'd dream of David, but not as accusation, as memory, as someone who'd been loved and lost, but not betrayed. The forest would still be there tomorrow, patient and eternal, keeping its secrets. But Robert Fitzgerald had learned something in that grove. Some debts could never be repaid, some wrongs could never be righted, some ghosts could never be laid to rest. The only choice was whether you let them consume you, or whether you acknowledged them and kept walking anyway. He chose to keep walking. Olivia Rhodes was released from the hospital 6 weeks after her rescue. She left Olympic National Park and never returned. She abandoned her research, changed her focus to marine ecosystems far from any forest. When asked about her experience, she would say only that she'd gotten lost, gotten cold, gotten confused. The details were gone, thankfully gone. But sometimes late at night in her Seattle apartment, she would wake from dreams of a woman singing in a language she didn't know, of cold that reached bone deep, of walking in circles while something watched from the trees. And she would find long black hairs on her pillow that weren't hers, strands that dissolved like smoke when she tried to pick them up. The forest had released her, but it hadn't forgotten. Robert Fitzgerald continued working at Olympic National Park for 7 more years. He led the campaign to install a memorial for Tanaka Yukiko in the North Grove. A simple stone marker with her name and dates, acknowledging a life stolen and a death unmourned. He never told anyone about what he'd really seen that day, about the spirit who'd shown him his own ghosts so he could learn to live without them. But sometimes when he walked the Hall of Mosses trail alone, he would hear singing, faint, distant, no longer full of rage but something else, something like peace slowly, impossibly approaching. And he would stop and bow, a silent acknowledgement to a woman who'd waited nearly a century to be seen as human again. The Hoh rainforest keeps its secrets still. Hikers report strange experiences sometimes, voices in languages they don't recognize, cold spots on warm days, the feeling of being watched by something that isn't hostile, but isn't entirely friendly either. The Park Service logs these reports and files them under environmental confusion and psychological stress. But the rangers who work there, the ones who've been there long enough to feel the forest's age, know differently. They know that some places remember, that some sorrows saturate the ground too deeply to ever fully fade, that the line between the natural and supernatural is thinner than maps suggest. They know that the forest is patient, that it waits, that it witnesses everything, forgives nothing, and forgets even less. And they walk carefully in the old groves, especially the ones where the trees grow twisted and the moss hangs heavy, and the silence feels like listening. They walk carefully, and they respect what they cannot see. And they remember that some debts are paid not in justice but in acknowledgement, not in forgetting but in bearing witness. The photographs Robert found that day were never explained. They weren't in his report because he couldn't explain them. But he kept them, tucked into the back of Tanaka Yukiko's historical file, evidence of something that couldn't be proven but couldn't be denied. Sometimes he would take them out and look at them, at the impossible angles, at Olivia Rhodes's expression of knowledge without understanding, at the shadow that shouldn't exist. And he would think about the forest's memory, about how it stores everything, pain and joy, death and life, rage and forgiveness all layered together in soil and root and leaf. About how the supernatural isn't separate from the natural but woven through it like water through earth, visible only when conditions align. He would think about Tanaka Yukiko, who'd wanted only to be seen, to be real, to matter. And he would think about David, who'd never blamed him, who'd been gone all along, whose death was tragedy but not betrayal. And then he would close the file, put the photographs away, and go back to work protecting a forest that protected its own secrets, that punished some and spared others according to mathematics he'd never fully understand. The forest would still be there tomorrow, patient, eternal, remembering everything, and Robert Fitzgerald would still be there too, walking carefully through the shadows between the trees, carrying his dead but no longer carried by them, a ranger who understood that sometimes the best you can do is witness the pain, acknowledge the grief, and keep walking anyway. The Ho River flows on, indifferent and ancient. The trees grow, die, and feed new growth. The moss absorbs rain and memory in equal measure, and somewhere in the North Grove a stone marker bears a name that was almost forgotten but now, finally, is remembered. Tanaka Yukiko, 1895-1923. May she rest in peace. But the forest knows what the stone doesn't say, that some rest isn't peaceful, that some peace is only exhaustion from endless rage, that some spirits never truly rest but only wait, watching the living with eyes that have seen too much and forgiven too little. The forest knows, the forest remembers, the forest keeps its secrets, and the rangers walk carefully through the green twilight, respecting what they cannot see. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The trees in the Ho had been weeping for 6 days straight. Not rain. David Ramirez knew rain. This was something else, something that made the moss hang heavier, made the silence between drops feel like held breath. He stood at the trailhead of the Ho River Trail, staring into the cathedral darkness of the temperate rainforest, and felt the old familiar weight settle into his chest. The weight that had been there since Cascade River, since Miguel, since the water. 3 years. 3 years since he'd watched his partner's hand slip from his grip in the current, since he'd surfaced alone. Lungs burning, Miguel's name tearing from his throat until it was just raw sound. 3 years of therapy-mandated desk work, of incident reports that never felt complete, of waking up reaching for someone who wasn't there. 6 months since they'd let him back in the field, back to doing what he'd sworn he'd never do again. And now this. Megan Price, 26, solo hiker. Last seen 4 days ago heading toward Blue Glacier. Her satellite beacon had activated briefly on day 2, then gone silent. Her GPS coordinates placed her somewhere along the upper trail, past the ranger station, deep in the old growth where the Sitka spruce reached heights that made you forget the sky existed. David adjusted his pack, Osprey Ether 70, 60 pounds of gear that felt like nothing compared to what he carried inside, and checked his radio. Motorola XPR 7550, fully charged, though signal would be intermittent at best once he passed Lewis Meadow. His Garmin GPS Map 64 showed the trail stretching ahead like a promise the forest didn't intend to keep. Base, this is Ramirez. Beginning trail ascent at 0847 hours. Static answered him, then Sarah's voice, the new dispatcher, young enough that she still believed missing hikers were just lost. Copy that, David. Weather's supposed to hold, but you know the Ho. Stay sharp. Stay sharp. as if he'd been anything but since Cascade River, as if the edges of his awareness hadn't been honed to the point of pain, every shadow a threat, every silence a scream waiting to happen. He started walking. The Ho River Trail was supposed to be easy, relatively flat, well-maintained, popular enough that you rarely went more than an hour without seeing day hikers. But it had been raining for almost a week, and the usual foot traffic had dried up. David passed empty campsites, abandoned fire rings that looked like they hadn't been used in days. The nurse logs, massive fallen Sitka spruce hosting entire ecosystems on their decaying backs, seemed to pulse with a life that had nothing to do with the ferns and seedlings growing from their bark. By mile 3, he knew something was wrong. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels chittering in the canopy, no rustling in the undergrowth, just the sound of water dripping from every surface, each drop timed to an irregular heartbeat that made his skin prickle. At mile 5, he found her pack. It sat in the middle of the trail, carefully positioned, not discarded. David approached slowly, hand moving instinctively to the canister of bear spray on his belt, even though he knew, had always known, that there were worse things in these woods than bears. The pack was a Gregory Diva 60, women's fit, teal and gray. Megan's name was written in Sharpie on the top flap. David pulled on his gloves. Evidence protocol, even though something in his gut told him this had moved beyond protocol, and opened it. Everything was still inside. Sleeping bag, tent, food, water filter, first aid kit. Her wallet with her ID and credit cards. Her phone, dead, but present. Nobody abandoned a pack like this, not with everything they needed to survive. Nobody except someone who didn't need it anymore, or someone who'd been taken. David keyed his radio. Base, this is Ramirez. Found the missing hiker's pack at approximately mile 5, trail marker 52. Pack is intact, all gear present, proceeding to last known coordinates. Silence answered him. He checked the radio. Full signal, according to the display. But only static came back when he tried again. He looked up at the canopy. The Sitka spruce towered overhead, their trunks wider than truck beds, their branches creating a gloom that felt less like shade and more like the forest closing its eyes. Moss hung in curtains, thick as rope, swaying in a breeze that David couldn't feel. And there, carved into the nearest tree, barely visible under the moss, Japanese characters, kanji. David had seen enough international hikers to recognize the script, but he couldn't read it. The carving was old, the bark healing around it, but still visible, still deliberate. He took a photo with his camera, protocol again, though his hands shook slightly as he did it, and continued up the trail. The coordinates Megan's beacon had transmitted placed her another 3 miles ahead, past Lewis Meadow, approaching the glacier. David's pace quickened despite every instinct screaming at him to turn back. He'd failed Miguel. He wouldn't fail another. The trail began to climb, switchbacks cutting through terrain that grew increasingly wild. The moss thickened, the trees pressed closer, and everywhere on nearly every other tree, those carved characters, always the same ones, always at chest height, as if someone had walked this trail marking it, claiming it. David's breath came harder, and not from exertion. The temperature was dropping. In June, in a temperate rainforest where the climate stayed relatively mild year-round, he could see his breath now, small clouds that dissipated into the green darkness like ghosts. At Lewis Meadow, he found the first photograph. It was pinned to a tree with a long, thin needle. No, not a needle, a hairpin. Black lacquer, decorated with a small white flower. The photograph showed a woman, Asian, young, smiling at the camera. She wore a white dress, simple, elegant. Behind her, David recognized the Ho River Trail. This trail, this exact location. He removed the photograph carefully, bagged it, and saw what had been behind it. More kanji carved into the bark. And below that, fresher, still bleeding sap, English words. She waits in the water. David's radio crackled. Not static this time, something else. A voice, distant, distorted, female, speaking Japanese. The words rose and fell in a cadence that sounded less like communication and more like incantation. "Base, do you copy? Sarah, are you there?" Only the Japanese voice answered, growing clearer, closer. David recognized one word, repeated over and over. "Modot." "Come back. Return." He turned off the radio. His hands were shaking openly now. The air had grown colder still, cold enough that the moisture on the trees was beginning to frost. In June, at sea level, impossible. David forced himself forward. Another mile. The beacon coordinates were close now. Megan was close. The trail opened onto a clearing and David stopped so abruptly he nearly fell. The trees formed a perfect circle. Inside the circle, the ground was covered in photographs. Hundreds of them, thousands, all showing the same woman from different angles, different days, different years. Some were old, faded, the colors bleeding into sepias. Others were fresh, printed on modern photo paper. All showed the woman in white. And in the center of the circle, standing perfectly still, was Megan Price. She faced away from David, her hair hanging wet and dark down her back. She wore what she'd been reported missing in: North Face jacket, Columbia hiking pants, Merrell boots, but she stood in a way that made David's throat close. Too straight, too still. Like a mannequin, like something waiting. "Megan?" His voice came out hoarse. "Megan Price?" She didn't turn, didn't move, but she spoke, and the voice that came from her mouth wasn't hers. It was the voice from the radio. Clear now, close, speaking English with an accent that seemed to come from another era entirely. "You came back. I'm Ranger David Ramirez. I'm here to help you. Are you injured? You came back." The same words, same inflection. "You promised you would come back." David's training told him to approach, check for injuries, assess the situation, but every instinct, honed by loss, sharpened by grief, screamed at him to run. He took a step forward anyway. The temperature plummeted. His breath came in clouds so thick he could barely see through them. The photographs on the ground began to rustle, lifting in a wind that David still couldn't feel, swirling around Megan like leaves, like snow, like words written in a language he couldn't read. Megan turned. Her face was white, not pale, white, like paper, like bone, like the absence of blood. Her eyes were open but filmed over, milky, seeing nothing and everything. Her mouth moved, and though her lips shaped words, the voice came from somewhere else, somewhere deeper. "I waited. You said you would come back. You said." And then David saw what was behind her. The woman in white stood at the edge of the clearing. Not translucent, not ghostly. Solid, real, more real than anything else in the forest. She wore the same dress from the photographs, but it was wet now, clinging to her frame, dripping water that didn't soak into the ground but pooled and spread like blood. Her hair fell forward, covering her face completely, reaching almost to her waist, black and glistening and somehow wrong. David's hand moved to his radio by instinct, but he knew it wouldn't work. Knew that whatever this was, it existed outside the reach of radio waves and emergency protocols and search and rescue procedures. The woman in white tilted her head, an inhuman movement, too sharp, too precise. And then she began to walk toward Megan, not stepping exactly, gliding, the water spreading beneath her feet with each impossible stride. "No," David's voice cracked. "Leave her alone." The woman stopped. Slowly she raised one hand, pale, long-fingered, nails painted white, and pushed her hair aside. David had seen death before, had seen Miguel's face in the water, lifeless, had pulled bodies from rivers and ravines and crevasses, but nothing had prepared him for this face. It was beautiful and terrible, perfect and ruined, alive with a hatred so pure it felt like heat despite the cold. Her eyes met his, and David understood. She wasn't here for Megan. She'd never been here for Megan. She was here for him. The memories hit like a physical blow. Not his memories. Hers. A woman named Keiko Tanaka, 24, exchange student at University of Washington, hiking the Ho River Trail in 1997, meeting a man, a ranger, someone she trusted. Promises made, promises broken, and then the water, the cold water of the Ho River, hands pushing her under, holding her down, her lungs filling as she tried to scream his name. Miguel Rodriguez, David's partner, David's friend. Except Miguel had never been just David's friend. Before the transfer to North Cascades, Miguel had been stationed here at Olympic, and there had been an incident, a closed investigation, a female hiker found drowned. Accidental death, the report had said. Tragic. The woman's family in Japan had protested, claimed it was murder, but there was no evidence. The case went cold. Miguel transferred north. And then, 3 years ago, in the Cascade River, Miguel had slipped. David had tried to hold on, had reached for him, had watched the water take him. But maybe it hadn't been an accident. Maybe the water had been taking back what was owed. I didn't know, David whispered. I didn't know what he did. The woman, Keiko, tilted her head again. The hatred in her eyes never wavered. You let him go. Her voice was a whisper that filled the entire clearing. You pulled him from the water once. I pulled him back. And still, you mourn him. He was my partner, my friend. He was a murderer. The truth of it settled into David's bones, the pieces clicking into place. Miguel's drinking, his nightmares, the way he'd always refused to talk about his time at Olympic, the way he'd looked at the water that day on Cascade River just before he fell, not afraid but resigned, as if he'd been expecting it. Why Megan? David's voice was steady now, though everything inside him was breaking. She's innocent. So was I. Keiko moved closer, the water spreading, rising, pooling around Megan's feet. But I learned that innocence does not protect us from those who wear righteousness like a mask. He wore his ranger uniform. He spoke of conservation, of sacred duties. And then he drowned me because I threatened to expose what he had done to others. Others? How many? How many hikers who'd gone missing over the years, written off as accidents, as exposure, as bad luck? Take me, David said. The words came without thought, but once spoken, he knew they were right. Let her go. Take me instead. Keiko stopped, studied him with those terrible eyes. You would trade yourself? Yes. Why? You did not know her. She is nothing to you. Because I couldn't save him. David's voice broke. I couldn't save Miguel. Not from drowning. Not from whatever drove him to do what he did. But I can save her. For a long moment, nothing moved. The forest held its breath. The photograph suspended in the air like frozen rain. Then Keiko spoke, and her voice was different, softer, sadder. You truly did not know. No. You grieved him. Yes. You would have saved him, even knowing. David closed his eyes. Yes. The cold began to recede. When David opened his eyes, Megan was crumpling to the ground, color flooding back into her face, and Keiko stood directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the water dripping from her hair wasn't water at all, but tears. He never came back, she whispered. He promised he would come back, and then he drowned me. I waited, in the water, in the dark, waiting for him to keep his promise. I'm sorry, David said, and meant it. I'm so sorry. Keiko reached out one pale hand, pressed it against David's chest, over his heart. The cold was absolute, reaching into him, freezing the guilt and grief and weight he'd carried since Cascade River. You let him go, she said. Let me go too. How? Remember me, not him. Remember Keiko Tanaka. Remember that I loved this forest. Remember that I did not deserve to die. Remember that I waited, and no one came. I'll remember, David whispered. I promise. The woman in white smiled. It was terrible and beautiful and human, Then I can rest. She began to fade, not vanishing but dissolving like mist in morning sun. The photographs fell from the air, scattering across the ground. The temperature rose. The sound of birds returned to the forest, tentative at first, then growing in confidence. And David stood in a clearing full of evidence of a death that had been covered up for 12 years, with an unconscious hiker at his feet and a promise to keep. Megan woke in the hospital 2 days later with no memory of anything after the second day of her hike. Hypothermia, the doctor said. Exposure. Lucky that Ranger Ramirez found her when he did. She'd been in a fugue state, wandering, delusional, common with severe cases. She'd recover fully. David filed his report meticulously, described finding Megan in the clearing, described the hypothermic symptoms, did not describe the woman in white, the photographs, the impossible cold, but he included everything else: the location, the coordinates, the carved kanji on the trees. And he made a phone call to a family in Osaka, Japan, told them that their daughter, Keiko Tanaka, had not died by accident, that there had been a cover-up, that he had evidence, photographs, carvings, enough to reopen the case, that their daughter deserved justice. The investigation took 6 months. Miguel's personnel file was reviewed. Other cases from his time at Olympic were examined. 3 other female hikers, all international, all ruled accidental drownings. The pattern was undeniable. Miguel Rodriguez was posthumously stripped of his badge and benefits. The families were notified. Keiko's body, never recovered from the Ho River, was memorialized with a plaque at the trailhead. David requested the placement, made sure the kanji on the plaque matched the characters carved into the trees, made sure Keiko Tanaka's name was there, permanent, remembered. He left Olympic National Park after that, took a position at Mount Rainier, somewhere without rivers, without the weight of water and broken promises. But he visited the memorial twice a year, in spring and in fall, and each time he left flowers, white chrysanthemums traditional for mourning in Japan, and spoke her name aloud. Keiko Tanaka, I remember you. You did not deserve what happened. You loved this forest, and you waited, and I came, even if I was not who you were waiting for. Rest now, please rest. The forest never answered, but sometimes on the clearest days when the light filtered through the Sitka spruce just right, David could have sworn he saw a figure in white between the trees. Not threatening, not vengeful, just watching, just there. And sometimes, very rarely, when the wind moved through the moss, he heard a voice whisper in Japanese, "Arigato." Thank you. David learned the word, kept it close, let it replace the weight he'd carried since Cascade River, because he'd finally understood something Miguel never had, that the ghosts we carry aren't always our own, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't holding on. It's knowing when to let go and when to remember. The Ho River keeps flowing, the forest keeps growing, and Keiko Tanaka's name remains carved into the memory of Olympic National Park, not as a victim forgotten, but as a woman remembered. A promise kept, even if it took 12 years and a ranger who couldn't save his partner but could finally save someone else, to make it true. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. James Whitmore's thermometer read -42 degrees, but his coffee was boiling over. He stared at the impossibility for 3 full seconds before his training kicked in. Check the equipment, verify the malfunction, document the anomaly. The digital thermometer mounted outside the ranger cabin's window displayed 42-degree air in bright red numerals that didn't flicker or fade, functioning normally, as far as he could tell. But the coffee in his titanium camp mug bubbled and steamed like it was sitting on a burner, condensation fogging his reading glasses despite the brutal January cold that should have frozen the moisture in the air. 18 years as a backcountry ranger in Glacier National Park, and James had never seen anything his experience couldn't explain. Equipment failures, sure, Paradoxical undressing and hypothermia victims, absolutely. But this, localized thermodynamic impossibility, didn't fit any framework he'd developed across nearly 2 decades of winter patrols in some of the most hostile wilderness in the lower 48. He set the mug down carefully on the cabin's rough-hewn table, watched steam continue rising in defiance of the temperature differential that should have frozen it solid. Outside, the January sun hung low over the Continental Divide, turning snow-covered peaks the color of dried blood. Glacier National Park in deep winter was a study in extremes. Beauty so profound it hurt to witness, and cold so absolute it could kill an unprepared hiker in under an hour. James had come to check on the seasonal research cabin at the head of Kintla Lake, a routine patrol that took him 23 miles into backcountry accessible only by snowshoe this time of year. The cabin was maintained jointly by the NPS and University of Montana for wildlife studies, but in January it sat empty, or should have. 3 days ago, a graduate student named Megan Price had filed a permit for a solo winter wildlife observation trip, studying lynx predation patterns on snowshoe hare populations. Her faculty advisor had called yesterday, concerned that Megan wasn't responding to scheduled check-ins via satellite phone. James had volunteered immediately, not because he doubted Megan's competence. Her permit application showed solid winter camping experience, but because he knew these mountains in ways that couldn't be taught in any outdoor education program. He knew how the wind could strip heat from exposed skin in seconds, how the snow could swallow a person without trace, how the winter dark in these valleys could make even experienced outdoors people question their sanity. What he didn't know was why his coffee was boiling at -42 degrees. He pulled out his incident log, a weatherproof notebook he'd filled with thousands of entries over the years, and documented the observation with the same methodical precision that had made him one of the most respected rangers in the region. 14:30 hours, Kintla Research Cabin, thermometer reading 42 degrees, observed boiling in hot coffee, approx 190 degrees when poured 5 minutes prior, possible equipment malfunction, will verify with backup analog thermometer. The backup confirmed the digital reading, -42, and getting colder. James stepped outside, his breath crystallizing instantly into ice particles that fell like diamond dust. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, no sounds except the crunch of his pack boots on wind-packed snow. The research cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by subalpine fir so heavily laden with snow that their branches bent nearly to the ground, creating caverns of shadow beneath each tree. Beyond the clearing, the forest stretched in all directions, a maze of white and black and the deep green of conifers that looked almost artificial against the snow's brightness. Megan Price's snowshoe tracks led northeast from the cabin, toward the drainage that fed into Kintla Creek. James followed them for 50 yards, noting the competent stride, the proper spacing, the efficient kicksteps where she'd ascended a small rise. Everything about the tracks suggested someone who knew what they were doing. They were also 3 days old, filled partially with wind-blown snow but still clearly visible. Then they stopped, not gradually, not with any indication of turning around or deviating. One moment, the tracks proceeded in a clear line toward the drainage. The next moment, nothing. Just undisturbed snow stretching in every direction. Wind sculpted into sastrugi patterns that would have taken hours to form. James's pulse kicked up despite his experience. This was wrong. People didn't vanish mid-stride. There had to be an explanation. Wind fill, drifting, some optical illusion created by the angle of light and shadow. He circled the area carefully, searching for any indication of where the tracks resumed, but found only that perfect snow surface, unmarred except by his own fresh boot prints. He pulled out his Garmin GPS unit, marked the coordinates, and activated his Motorola radio. "Whitmore to base, come in." "Static then." "Base here. Go ahead, James." "I'm at Kintla Research Cabin. Found anomalous track evidence for missing hiker Price. Tracks terminate approximately 50 yards northeast of cabin with no continuation. Advise." A pause, longer than normal. Then, "Copy that. Weather's moving in fast, James. Front's ahead of schedule. You've got maybe 2 hours of clear before it hits. Advise you secure the cabin and wait it out rather than continuing search in deteriorating conditions." James looked at the sky. Clear blue, no clouds visible, but he trusted the meteorologists more than his own observations. Weather in Glacier could change in minutes, storms materializing from apparently clear skies with lethal speed. Understood. We'll secure location and resume search after front passes. Whitmore out. He returned to the cabin, his mind working through possible explanations for the vanishing tracks. Megan could have retraced her steps exactly. Difficult but possible for someone with solid orienteering skills. She could have climbed a tree, though James saw no disturbance in the snow around any trunks nearby. She could have been picked up by helicopter, though no flight plans had been filed, and he'd have heard the rotors even in his sleep. Or something else had happened, something his 18 years of experience didn't provide framework for. Inside the cabin, his coffee had frozen solid in the mug. The temperature reading now showed 47 degrees F and dropping. James's unease crystallized into something harder, colder. He'd survived nearly 2 decades in backcountry because he paid attention to his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was screaming that something fundamental had broken in this small corner of wilderness. The rules that governed thermal dynamics, that explained human behavior, that made the natural world predictable, those rules had stopped applying somewhere between Megan's last footprint and the undisturbed snow beyond. He checked the cabin thoroughly, looking for any sign Megan had returned. Her gear was still there. Sleeping bag rated to 40-degree warms, camp stove with full fuel canisters, food supplies carefully stored in bear canisters despite it being winter, when bears were hibernating. Her satellite phone sat on the table beside her field notes, battery dead. James plugged it into his solar charger, waiting for it to power up while he read through her observations. The notes started normally. Lynx tracks observed, scat analysis, prey remains documented with photographs. Megan wrote in a clear, scientific hand, her observations precise and professional. But the entries from 3 days ago showed a change in tone. Unusual thermal readings, camera batteries dying in minutes despite being warm. Local Blackfeet legends mention winter that eats in this drainage. Asked cabin maintenance worker about it. He laughed, said scientists don't believe in Wetico. When I asked what that meant, he said I should leave before the solstice moon. That was 4 days ago. It's just folklore, but the cold here feels different. Hungry. James's stomach tightened. Wetico. He knew the word, though not well. Some kind of creature from Blackfeet or other Algonquian traditions. He'd heard it mentioned occasionally by tribal members who worked with the Park Service, usually in context that made it clear they weren't joking even if they wouldn't elaborate to outsiders. Something about cannibalism, about winter, about hunger that couldn't be satisfied. The satellite phone finally powered on, beeping with a backlog of messages. James scrolled through them. Increasingly concerned texts from Megan's advisor, her roommate, her parents. The last message she'd sent was brief. Something outside, not animal, moving wrong, cold, getting worse. We'll document and report. No photos attached, no further clarification. The timestamp was 72 hours ago, right around the time her tracks would have been made. James stood abruptly, moved to the cabin's single window. Outside, the light had changed. Not darker exactly, but thinner, as if the sun's warmth had been filtered out while the illumination remained. The shadows under the snow-bent firs seemed deeper, more absolute, and in those shadows, James saw movement, fast and angular, too quick for his eye to follow, there and gone between one heartbeat and the next. He grabbed his binoculars, scanned the tree line. Nothing. Just snow and silence and that peculiar quality of light that made distances impossible to judge. But he'd seen something. His eyes didn't lie, even if his mind was struggling to process what they'd reported. The thermometer now read 53 degrees. Functionally impossible. The historical record for this area in January bottomed out around 35 degrees. This was entering Siberian territory, temperatures that required specialized gear and protocols James didn't have. His clothing was rated for 30 degrees, adequate for typical glacier winter patrols but catastrophically insufficient if the thermometer was accurate. Yet he wasn't cold. That was the thing his mind kept snagging on. He should be hypothermic by now, shivering violently, his core temperature dropping into dangerous ranges. Instead, he felt comfortable, almost warm, as if his body had stopped responding appropriately to the environmental temperature. Or as if the cold wasn't physical, as if it was something else entirely, masquerading in familiar form. James forced himself to think methodically. Equipment malfunction remained the most likely explanation, a short in the thermometer, creating false readings. The boiling coffee could have been residual heat from pouring, misperceived in the stress of searching for a missing person. The vanishing tracks, wind fill. The movement in the trees, probably a pine marten or snowshoe hare, glimpsed peripherally and magnified by isolation anxiety. Except he'd never experienced isolation anxiety, not in 18 years, not even on solo winter patrols that lasted a week or more. James Whitmore didn't panic. He assessed, planned, executed. That reliability was what made him valuable, what made him the ranger supervisor sent into backcountry when situations got complicated. But this situation wasn't complicated. It was impossible. And impossibility didn't exist in James's understanding of how wilderness worked. The sun dropped toward the western peaks, and with it the temperature. 58 degrees. James's breath should have been crystallizing into sheets of ice. His extremities should have been going numb. Instead, he felt that strange warmth, and underneath it something else. Hunger. Not ordinary hunger, the kind that came from a long snowshoe trek burning calories. This was different. Deeper. Like his stomach had become a vacuum that no amount of food could fill. He forced himself to eat anyway. Trail mix, jerky, a freeze-dried meal heated with his camp stove. The food tasted like ash, like it had been dead for years, like chewing on something that had never been alive to begin with. He ate mechanically, fueling his body because training said he should, but deriving no satisfaction or sustenance from it. The hunger remained, growing sharper with each swallow. Outside, full dark settled over the cabin. James had his headlamp, his backup flashlight, candles, and a kerosene lamp for extended light. But when he looked out the window, he saw that the darkness wasn't uniform. Patches of deeper black moved through the forest, zones where even starlight couldn't penetrate. And in those zones he glimpsed shapes that moved like humans but weren't, that stood upright but had proportions all wrong. Too tall, too thin, limbs that bent at joints that shouldn't exist. His radio crackled without him transmitting. A voice, but not the dispatcher's. Not any human voice. It spoke in a language James didn't know. Guttural clicking, sounds that seemed to come from a throat not designed for human speech. The words meant nothing to him, but the tone was clear. Mockery, invitation, hunger, recognizing hunger. James turned off the radio with hands that shook despite his years of experience. This was beyond equipment failure, beyond hallucination induced by altitude or cold or stress. This was something real and predatory and intelligent, something that had taken Megan Price and was now circling him like a wolf testing prey, looking for weakness. He remembered fragments from training sessions on indigenous perspectives, cultural sensitivity workshops the Park Service mandated. The Blackfeet elder who'd spoken about the land having memory, about certain places being dangerous not because of terrain or weather, but because of what lived there. Things that had been here long before humans, that would be here long after, that sometimes noticed people in ways that were never good. Wetiko. The word kept surfacing in his mind. The winter that eats. Cannibalism spirit. Hunger without end. James had dismissed it as metaphor, as cultural narrative not meant to be taken literally. But metaphors didn't leave gaps in snow, didn't make temperatures drop to impossible lows, didn't speak through radios in languages that predated English by millennia. He barricaded the door with everything movable, the table, benches, supply crates, not because barriers would help if something truly wanted in, but because action kept panic at bay, gave his hands something to do while his mind raced through options that all ended badly. He couldn't wait out the weather if the weather wasn't natural, couldn't navigate back to headquarters if something was hunting him, Couldn't radio for help if the radio was compromised. The window shattered inward without warning. Not breaking, not cracking, but simply ceasing to exist. As if the glass had decided to stop being solid and become scattered fragments on the cabin floor. Frigid air poured through the opening, and with it the smell. Decay and cold, and underneath both, the copper-sweet scent of blood so fresh it was still warm. James grabbed his bear spray, useless against what he was facing but the only weapon he carried, and backed against the far wall. Through the empty window frame he saw it clearly for the first time, and his mind tried desperately to categorize it as something known, something explainable, even as every cell in his body recognized it as other. Taller than any human, 8 feet at minimum, skeletal but somehow massive as if its bones were denser than they should be, heavier with accumulated cold and hunger. Its skin, if it had skin, was the gray-white of freezer burn, stretched too tight over a frame that suggested starvation taken to its absolute extreme. But the eyes were worst. Human eyes, intelligent and aware and filled with a ravenous need that went beyond physical hunger into something existential, metaphysical, a void that consumed not just flesh but meaning itself. It didn't climb through the window. It was simply inside, occupying space that had been empty a moment before, bringing with it that impossible cold that froze James's breath in his lungs, even as his body insisted he was warm, comfortable, safe. When it spoke, the words were English, but the voice was wrong, layered as if multiple throats were forming sounds in rough approximation of human speech. The woman tasted of fear and ambition. What will you taste of, Ranger? 18 winters in these mountains, 18 years thinking you understood what lived here. You know nothing. You've understood nothing. And now you'll learn. James sprayed the bear spray directly into the creature's face. The orange mist hung in the air for a moment, then froze solid, falling as crystalline powder. The thing that had been called Wedico, that his grandmother's stories had warned about even though she wasn't Blackfeet or Algonquian, but her own people had similar legends under different names. It didn't even blink. Iron and steel, it said, reaching out with fingers that were too long, too many jointed. Silver and salt, fire and prayer. Your people have forgotten the old defenses, forgotten why we were feared. The hunger remembers, Ranger. The hunger never forgets. James ran. Not out the door. That was blocked by his own barricade and would take precious seconds to clear. Through the window, glass fragments slicing his jacket as he dove into snow so deep it swallowed him to the chest. He floundered, fought his way upright, lunged toward the tree line where at least the forest would provide cover. Obstacles. Something between him and the thing that moved through the cabin doorway with the casual ease of a predator who knew its prey had nowhere to go. The snowshoes were back in the cabin. His GPS was in the cabin. His radio, his emergency beacon, his survival gear, all back in the cabin with the thing that wore hunger like a second skin. James had his headlamp, the clothes on his back, and approximately 2 hours before the cold killed him if the Wedico didn't. He ran anyway because stopping meant dying, and at least movement created the illusion of agency. The snow dragged at him, each step requiring full effort to lift his legs high enough to clear the depth, his heart hammering in his chest from exertion and terror in equal measure. Behind him, movement. Not footsteps. The Wedico didn't leave tracks, he realized, didn't displace snow or break branches or create any of the normal signs that indicated passage through wilderness. It simply was, occupying different positions as if teleporting short distances, closing the gap between them with casual inevitability. James's headlamp beam caught it in stroboscopic flashes. There, between two firs, limbs splayed at impossible angles. There, ahead of him, somehow despite having been behind seconds ago, there crouched in snow that showed no depression, no evidence anything physical rested there. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, and underneath the exertion, that hunger grew, spreading through him like infection, making his mouth water at the thought of warm meat, fresh blood, the sustenance that was running just ahead of him. James stumbled, horror overriding exhaustion as he realized what he was thinking. About himself, about his own flesh as food. The Wedico didn't just hunt, It corrupted, transformed, made its prey into itself through that insatiable hunger that recognized no boundary between self and other, predator and prey. He forced the thoughts down, focused on surviving. There, ahead, barely visible in his headlamp beam, a jumble of boulders forming a small cave, probably a hibernaculum for marmots or bears in warmer months. James dove for it, squeezed into the opening, pressed himself against stone that radiated cold like a physical force. The Wedico stopped outside, its form silhouetted against starlight that seemed to bend around it, creating an absence rather than a presence. When it spoke again, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere. The woman tried hiding too, in a hollow tree, like a frightened animal. It took 3 days for hunger to drive her out. How long will you last, Ranger? How long before the cold stops being cold and starts being truth? Before you understand that flesh is just fuel, that survival requires sacrifice, that the taboo exists because the temptation is real? James didn't answer, couldn't answer. His mind was racing through every survival technique he'd learned, every protocol for backcountry emergencies, and finding nothing that addressed supernatural predators that violated thermodynamics and spoke in riddles about cannibalism. Wait. Cannibalism. That was the key. The Wedico was created by humans who violated the ultimate taboo, who ate human flesh in desperation or madness, who crossed the line that separated human from animal. The story said it took people who were vulnerable to that temptation, who could be corrupted into joining the hunger. James wasn't starving, wasn't desperate, wasn't in any situation that would drive him to consider cannibalism even as metaphor. The Wedico had no leverage except fear, and fear alone wasn't enough to transform someone into. His stomach cramped violently, a pain so intense he doubled over, gasping. The hunger surged, no longer background sensation but overwhelming need. His body convinced it was starving despite having eaten less than 2 hours ago. His mouth watered, his teeth ached, and the thoughts came faster now, unbidden and horrible. Warmth inside flesh, nutrients that could sustain him through the winter. The simple biological fact that humans were made of the same proteins and fats as the animals he ate without moral complication. No. James gritted his teeth, bit his own tongue until he tasted blood. His own blood, not food, not sustenance, just proof he was still human. "I'm not starving," he said aloud, voice shaking. "I have supplies. I have training. I don't need to." The woman said the same thing. The Wedico interrupted. "For 3 days," she said it, while the cold worked into her bones and the hunger made promises. On the 4th day, she stopped saying it. On the 5th day, she stopped being human, and now she hunts with me, Ranger. Now she understands that hunger is the only truth, that everything else, civilization, morality, the thin line between human and animal, all of it is illusion we maintain only when our bellies are full. James's headlamp flickered, dimmed, went out. His backup batteries were in his pack, in the cabin, with the thing that spoke about Megan Price in past tense. That suggested she'd become what it was. That implied transformation was inevitable, and resistance only delayed the end. In the absolute darkness of the cave, James felt, rather than saw, the Wedico move closer. Heard its breath, or what approximated breath, moving air that should have been still. And underneath his horror, that hunger continued growing, reshaping his thoughts, making him calculate the caloric value of his own extremities. Wonder how long he could survive if he sacrificed a few fingers to the cold, and he screamed. Not from pain, but from the violation of having those thoughts, those calculations emerge from his own mind. Screamed until his throat was raw, until the sound echoed back from stone walls that seemed to press closer, until the Wedico's laughter filled the spaces between echoes. "Yes," it said. "Yes, that's the moment. When you realize the hunger isn't external, it's in you. It's been in you since your species learned to fear winter, to understand that survival sometimes requires horror. I don't create the hunger, Ranger. I just remove the barriers that keep you from acknowledging it." James fumbled with numb fingers for his emergency supplies. A single flare in his jacket pocket, saved for worst-case scenarios. This qualified. He struck it against stone, the magnesium igniting with painful brightness that made him squint, that pushed back the darkness and with it some of the oppressive hunger that had been crushing him. In the flare's light, he saw the Wetico clearly. Not one creature, but two, because Megan Price stood beside it. Her face gaunt and hollow-eyed, her hands tipped with fingers that had grown too long, too sharp, her clothing torn and stained with something dark that could have been dirt or dried blood. She looked at James with expression that held both recognition and something beyond humanity. A hunger that had burned away whoever she'd been and left only appetite. "I'm sorry," she said. And her voice was her own, still recognizably the graduate student who'd filed a careful research permit and documented Link's predation with scientific precision. "I didn't mean to. I was so hungry, and it kept saying the cold would kill me unless I ate, and there was..." She gestured vaguely at her own body. Parts that weren't essential. Toes that were already frostbitten. Fingers that couldn't feel anything. It seemed logical. It seemed like survival. And once I tasted warm flesh and fresh blood, the hunger it grew. It's all I am now. All I'll ever be. And I'm so hungry. The flare had maybe 2 minutes of burn time remaining. James had no weapons, no radio, no way to call for help even if help could arrive in time. The temperature inside the cave was dropping. Impossible, but happening anyway. His breath crystallizing into ice that stuck to his beard and eyebrows. He had only his 18 years of experience, his knowledge of these mountains, and one desperate realization. The Wetico hunted in winter because winter amplified hunger, created desperation, provided conditions where the taboo against cannibalism might be breached. But winter ended. Spring came. And with warmth, the hunger lost its leverage. "Fire," James said, the word emerging from some instinct deeper than training. "You're creatures of winter, of cold and hunger. Fire negates both." The Wetico's expression didn't change. If it had expressions, its face was too skeletal to show them, but it stepped back slightly, and Megan Price flinched, her corrupted hands moving to shield her face. James thrust the flare forward like a weapon, gaining his feet, advancing from the cave. "I'm not hungry," he said, forcing conviction into his voice even as his stomach cramped again, protesting the lie. "I'm warm. I have supplies. I have options. And I'm not dying in these mountains giving you the satisfaction of proving humans are just animals with pretensions." "Everyone is hungry," the Wetico said. But its voice had lost certainty, its form becoming less solid, as if James's rejection of its premise had weakened some fundamental aspect of its existence. Everyone can be corrupted. Everyone breaks eventually. "Maybe," James acknowledged, "but not tonight, not here. And not by you." The flare sputtered, its light failing. James braced himself for the attack he knew was coming, the final lunge when darkness returned and with it the full weight of the Wetico's hunger. He wouldn't survive. He understood that with perfect clarity, but he could die human, die refusing the transformation, die proving that 18 years in these mountains had taught him something essential about what separated him from the predators that shared this wilderness. The flare went out. In the darkness, James waited for teeth, for claws, for the hunger to overwhelm him in those final moments. Instead, he heard helicopter rotors, distant but approaching, and with them, light. Searchlights cutting through the trees, powerful beams that carved the darkness into retreat, illuminating the forest with artificial brightness that had nothing to do with fire or heat, but everything to do with humans refusing to surrender to winter. The Wetico screamed. A sound that wasn't language or rage but pure hunger denied, a void trying to swallow light and failing, and vanished. Not retreating, not running, simply ceasing to exist as if it had never been there except as nightmare given temporary form. Megan Price remained, collapsed in the snow, her form flickering between the corrupted thing she'd become and the young woman she'd been. In the searchlight's glow, James saw her hands return to normal proportions, her face regain human softness, her eyes clear from the void hunger that had consumed them. She looked at him with desperate clarity and whispered, "Kill me, please." I can still feel it inside, the hunger. It's waiting. When winter comes back, when I'm alone and cold and desperate, it'll return. I don't want to become that again. I don't want to... No, James said, moving to her side, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders even though his own body was shutting down from cold exposure, adrenaline crash, the accumulated trauma of the last few hours. You fight it. You survive. You bear witness to what happened here so others know, so they don't dismiss the warnings as superstition. The helicopter landed in the clearing near the cabin, rangers spilling out with medical gear and thermal blankets and questions James couldn't yet answer because he didn't understand himself what had happened, what he'd faced, what he'd barely survived. They evacuated both of them, James and Megan, flying through winter darkness toward lights and warmth and civilization. In the helicopter, wrapped in blankets but still feeling cold that had nothing to do with temperature, James looked at Megan Price and saw someone who would never be the same, who would carry the memory of transformation like a scar that never healed, who had learned exactly what humans could become when pushed beyond the boundaries that defined humanity. He understood, because he carried it too now. The knowledge that hunger wasn't just biological imperative, but existential threat. That the line between human and monster was measured in circumstances, in choices made when survival warred with morality, in the terrible fragility of the taboos that kept civilization intact. The investigation that followed was inconclusive. Equipment failure, hypothermia-induced hallucinations, trauma response to extreme cold exposure. The official report checked boxes that explained nothing essential. Megan Price withdrew from her graduate program, moved somewhere warm, somewhere the winters were mild and hunger never accumulated into the crushing weight that invited corruption. James Whitmore returned to work after 3 weeks of psychological evaluation and medical clearance. But he filed for transfer out of backcountry patrol, took a desk job coordinating from headquarters, never went more than a few miles into wilderness alone. The supervisors were disappointed. His experience was valuable, his instincts reliable, but they didn't argue. Something in his eyes told them that whatever had happened at Kintla Lake had broken something fundamental in the veteran ranger who'd survived 18 winters without question or doubt. He kept a journal now, documenting the things his official reports couldn't include. The Blackfeet elder who visited him in the hospital, who spoke about Wetico without surprise, who confirmed that some places in the mountains were thresholds where hunger took form, where humans learned what they were capable of when winter stripped away all comfort. The research he'd done into Algonquian legends, finding similar stories across dozens of tribal traditions. The Witiko, the Windigo, the Witico, all variations of the same essential truth, that humans contained the capacity for monstrous transformation, and that winter, with its cold and scarcity and isolation, had always been the season when those capacities manifested. On the anniversary of the incident, James returned to Kintla Lake. Not alone. He brought 3 other rangers, a satellite phone, emergency beacons, enough gear to supply a small expedition. They found the research cabin burned to the foundation, though no fire had been reported, and the surrounding forest showed no char marks. They found Megan Price's research notes scattered across the snow, each page documenting her transformation in clinical detail until the handwriting degraded into symbols that looked almost like writing, but conveyed nothing except hunger. And they found, carved into a massive subalpine fir at the edge of the clearing, words in a language James didn't know but understood anyway. A warning, or perhaps an invitation, suggesting that the Wetico waited still, that winter would return, that hunger never truly ended for those who'd tasted what Megan Price had tasted, what James himself had almost tasted in that cave, when his mind calculated the caloric value of his own flesh. He documented everything, added it to the growing file he kept at home, separate from official NPS records. Maybe someday someone would need this information. Maybe someday another ranger would face what he'd faced, and the knowledge that Wetico was real, that the hunger could corrupt even experienced wilderness professionals, would make the difference between survival and transformation. Or maybe not. Maybe each person had to face that particular horror alone, had to measure their own humanity against the void and hope their refusal held, when biology and circumstance conspired to break every moral boundary that separated them from their ancestors who huddled around fires, fearing the dark and the cold and the hunger that waited in both. James Whitmore never went back to Kintla Lake after that anniversary trip, but he thought about it constantly, especially in winter, especially when the temperature dropped and the hunger that lived in all humans grew a little sharper, a little harder to ignore. He thought about Megan Price, wherever she'd gone, and hoped she found warmth and food in circumstances that never tested her the way those 5 days at Kintla Lake had tested her. And sometimes, in the depths of January when the cold pressed against his windows and made the house creak with contraction, James wondered if he'd actually escaped the Wetico, or if he'd simply postponed transformation. If the hunger waited patient as winter itself, confident that eventually, inevitably, everyone broke. He didn't know the answer, wasn't sure he wanted to. Some knowledge extracted too high a price, and the cost of understanding what humans became when winter stripped away everything except the will to survive. That cost might be humanity itself. The mountains didn't care. The cold didn't care. And the hunger, that ancient voice that had whispered to humans since they first learned to fear starvation, waited patient as stone, knowing that winter always returned, that hunger never truly ended, that the line between human and monster was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. James Whitmore had survived, but he'd never stopped running from what he'd almost become in the moment. His mind calculated how much warmth his own fingers might provide, how long he could survive on the flesh he was born with, how logical and necessary and inevitable cannibalism seemed when hunger grew large enough to swallow all other considerations. That was the real horror, not the monster in the forest, but the monster in himself, waiting patient as winter for circumstances that would let it emerge. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The wolves were eating in formation. Lisa Hoffman had been observing Yellowstone's wildlife for 16 years, and she'd never seen anything like it. 5 gray wolves surrounding an elk carcass in Lamar Valley. But they weren't feeding the way wolves fed. They weren't tearing, competing, establishing hierarchy through aggression and submission. They were taking turns, precise, deliberate turns, each wolf stepping forward, taking exactly 3 bites, then stepping back while the next moved in. Like soldiers, like humans pretending to be wolves. Lisa adjusted her Bushnell spotting scope, zooming in from her position on the hillside. September 2007, early morning. The kind of clear day that made tourists think Yellowstone was a petting zoo instead of one of the most dangerous ecosystems in North America. She'd already radioed in 2 separate incidents of people trying to approach bison for photos. But this was something else. The wolves' movements were synchronized, unnatural. When one finished feeding, it didn't simply withdraw. It backed away without turning around, maintaining eye contact with the carcass as if performing a ritual. The others waited motionless until it was their turn. No body language, no communication Lisa could identify. Just eerie mechanical precision. She pulled out her Motorola radio. "This is Hoffman to base. I'm observing abnormal wolf behavior in Lamar Valley, approximately 2 miles northeast of the Institute, requesting any recent reports of wildlife acting unusual." Static, then the voice of Tom Chen, the dispatcher on duty. "Define unusual, Hoffman." "Coordinated feeding pattern. No aggression, no pack hierarchy visible. It's like they're..." She paused, aware of how ridiculous this would sound. "It's like they're following instructions." A longer pause. "You feeling okay out there?" Lisa grimaced. This was the problem with being a veteran. People assumed you'd seen everything, that nothing could surprise you. And if something did surprise you, maybe you were losing your edge. "I'm fine, Chen. Just documenting aberrant behavior. Has anyone reported sick or rabid wolves in this sector?" "Negative. All wildlife health reports normal for the season." A crackle of static. "Hey, you're still looking for that missing hiker, right? Car?" Lisa's attention sharpened. Sophia Carr, yes. Day 4 of the search. Why? Just got a call from a backpacker who says he found a campsite that looked abandoned in a hurry, about 3 miles from your position near Slough Creek. Thought you'd want to check it out before we send a full team. Send me the coordinates. Lisa copied down the GPS coordinates, then looked back through her scope. The wolves had finished feeding and were walking away. Not running, not trotting, but walking in single file like a military unit. The last wolf in line stopped, turned its head toward Lisa's position on the hillside, and stared directly at her despite being over 400 yards away and downwind. Its eyes caught the morning light wrong. Instead of the typical eye shine of a predator, the reflection was different, almost golden, almost human. Then it turned and followed the others into the tree line. Lisa packed her gear with practiced efficiency, trying to ignore the unease settling in her gut. 16 years in Yellowstone had taught her to trust her instincts, and her instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with those wolves. But she had a missing person to find, and Sophia Carr had already been gone too long. Sophia Carr, 23 years old, anthropology graduate student from the University of New Mexico, had been researching Native American historical sites in Yellowstone when she'd failed to check in 4 days ago. Her faculty advisor had finally called it in yesterday after multiple missed phone calls. Standard missing hiker case, except that Sophia had been experienced, well-equipped, and had left a detailed itinerary. She wasn't the type to just wander off trail. Lisa hiked the 3 miles to the coordinates, her Garmin GPS guiding her through terrain she knew by heart. The landscape here was different from the Olympic forest she'd worked before transferring to Yellowstone, open, exposed, dominated by vast grasslands and scattered lodgepole pines. Wildlife was visible everywhere. Bison herds, elk, pronghorn, making Lamar Valley one of the best wildlife viewing spots in North America. But that visibility cut both ways. There was nowhere to hide, which meant if Sophia was out here, someone should have spotted her by now. The campsite was exactly where the backpacker had reported it. Lisa could see immediately that something had gone wrong. The tent was still standing, but the rainfly was partially detached, flapping in the wind. A backpack lay on its side. Contents spilled across the ground. A sleeping bag was half unzipped, one corner dark with something that might have been mud or might have been blood. Lisa pulled on latex gloves and approached carefully, documenting everything with her digital camera. No obvious signs of bear activity, no claw marks, no scat, no cached food. No signs of a struggle exactly, but definite signs of hasty departure. Sophia's hiking boots were still in the tent. Her water bottles were full. Her journal was open to a page dated 3 days ago. Lisa read the entry, her unease deepening with each line. Day 6 of fieldwork. Found something incredible. A rock formation near Specimen Ridge that matches descriptions of a Navajo ceremonial site, which shouldn't exist this far north. The local Crow and Shoshone tribes have completely different traditions. This doesn't match any documented migration patterns. I need to document this, but something feels wrong about the place. The rocks are arranged in a specific pattern, and there are offerings, recent ones. Coins, tobacco, feathers. Someone is maintaining this site. When I got close, I heard something moving in the brush. Large animal, maybe elk. But it circled my position 3 times without showing itself. Could see the grass moving, hear it breathing. When I called out, it stopped. Complete silence for maybe 2 minutes. Then I heard my own voice calling back to me from the trees. My exact voice, saying my exact name. I left immediately. The next entry was shorter, dated 2 days ago. It followed me back to camp. I can hear it outside the tent at night. It walks on 2 legs sometimes, 4 legs other times. The footprints change. I took photos, but they came out wrong. Nothing but white light where the animal should be. My phone battery drains within minutes of charging. My radio only picks up static and something that sounds like chanting in a language I don't recognize. I think it's Navajo, but that's impossible. I need to hike out at first light. I need to leave. The final entry was just 3 words. Written in shaky handwriting. It knows names. Lisa photographed the journal pages, then searched the rest of the campsite. Sophia's phone was there, battery completely dead despite being a nearly new Motorola Razr that should hold a charge for days. Her radio was there too, a professional-grade Motorola XPR unit identical to Lisa's own. Lisa tried to turn it on. Nothing. The battery compartment was corroded, as if the radio had been submerged in water, except everything else in the tent was dry. Lisa keyed her own radio. "Chen, I'm at the car campsite. I need a full search and rescue team mobilized. Also need you to pull any historical records we have on Native American sites near Specimen Ridge. Carr's journal mentions a ceremonial site that shouldn't exist here." "Copy that. But Hoffman? That area's outside Carr's stated itinerary. Why would she go there?" "That's what I'm going to find out." Lisa spent the next hour securing the campsite and searching the immediate area for tracks. She found them 30 yards from the tent. Boot prints heading northeast toward Specimen Ridge and something else. Animal prints that started as wolf tracks, then shifted mid-stride to something else. Coyote, maybe, except the spacing was wrong. Then the prints became human footprints. Bare human feet, adult-sized, walking alongside Sophia's boot prints. Then the human prints vanished and the wolf prints returned. Except now they were on the opposite side of Sophia's trail, as if whatever was making them had jumped over her without disturbing the ground between steps. Lisa had seen a lot of strange things in 16 years. She'd seen bear tracks that seemed to vanish mid-trail, probably due to hard ground or wind covering them. She'd seen patterns in snow that suggested impossible movements, usually explained by multiple animals passing through at different times. She'd developed a healthy skepticism toward supernatural explanations because nature was weird enough without adding mysticism. But this was different. These tracks were fresh, probably from this morning, and they were impossible. Lisa photographed everything, then followed the trail. The tracks led northeast for 2 miles, crossing Slough Creek and climbing toward the ridge. The boot prints were clear and consistent, Sophia walking, not running, not panicked. But the animal prints kept changing. Wolf to coyote to something with cloven hooves, like an elk to something with paws too large to be any native species. And all of them circled Sophia's path, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always at a distance of 15 to 20 yards. Like something was pacing her, herding her. The trail led to the rock formation Sophia had described in her journal. Lisa spotted it from a quarter-mile away, a circle of standing stones about 40 feet in diameter, partially hidden by scrub pine. As she got closer, she could see that the stones weren't natural. They'd been placed deliberately, arranged in a pattern that created passages and chambers. The rocks themselves were wrong for this area. Red sandstone, the kind you'd find in Arizona or New Mexico, not Wyoming. This wasn't a historic site. This was recent. Maybe decades old, maybe less. Lisa approached cautiously. The offerings Sophia had mentioned were there. Coins scattered around the base of the stones, feathers tied to branches, small bundles of tobacco wrapped in red cloth, and something else. Fresh flowers. Wildflowers that shouldn't still be blooming this late in September, arranged in bundles around what looked like the entrance to the circle. Lisa pulled out her camera and started documenting. As she photographed the site, she noticed something disturbing. There were tracks everywhere inside the circle. Human footprints, all barefoot, all adult-sized, walking in spirals around the center. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, layered over each other. Some fresh, some old. All following the same clockwise pattern, spiraling inward to the center where the ground was dark and stained. Blood. Old blood, soaked into the earth. Lisa's radio crackled. She grabbed it, expecting Chen's voice. Instead, she heard static layered with something underneath. Singing. Low rhythmic chanting in a language she didn't recognize. The words rose and fell in patterns that made her teeth ache, made her vision blur at the edges. She turned off the radio. The singing continued. Not from the radio, from everywhere. From the rocks themselves resonating through the stone, vibrating in her bones. Lisa backed away from the circle. As she did, she saw movement in her peripheral vision. something large, moving through the trees to her left. She turned, hand on the bear spray at her belt, and caught a glimpse of something that made her brain stutter. A wolf. A gray wolf, walking upright on its hind legs. Its front paws dangled uselessly, but it moved with perfect balance, head tilted at an angle that was completely wrong for canine anatomy. It wore something around its neck, a necklace made of what looked like human finger bones. The wolf turned its head toward Lisa. Its eyes were human. Not like human eyes. They were human eyes, brown and aware and full of intelligence that no animal should possess. It opened its mouth, and Lisa heard her own voice come out. Lisa Hoffman, 16 years, Yellowstone, never believed. The wolf smiled. Wolves couldn't smile, but this thing smiled, pulling its lips back to reveal teeth that were too sharp, too many, arranged in rows like a shark. Lisa ran. She crashed through the brush, abandoning protocol, abandoning her careful documentation, abandoning everything except the primal need to get away. Behind her, she heard laughter, her own laughter, echoing from multiple directions. The ground shook with footsteps, too heavy to be a wolf, too fast to be human. Lisa burst out of the trees onto an open hillside and risked a look back. 3 wolves were following her, but they were running wrong. Their gaits were synchronized, mechanical, the same eerie precision she'd seen at the elk carcass. And they were faster than any wolf should be, closing the distance with impossible speed. Lisa keyed her radio while running. "Chen, emergency. I need immediate extraction at Specimen Ridge. Coordinates." She read off her GPS position while gasping for air. "I am being pursued by hostile wildlife. I need..." Static drowned her out. Then her own voice coming through the radio speaker. "Lisa Hoffman is lost. Lisa Hoffman is gone. Lisa Hoffman will not be found." The radio went dead. The battery indicator showed full charge, but the screen went black and stayed black. Lisa dropped the useless radio and focused on running. She was in good shape, maintained her fitness for exactly these situations, but the wolves weren't tiring. They paced her perfectly, maintaining a distance of about 50 yards, not trying to catch her yet, playing with her. She pulled out her bear spray knowing it was useless but needing something, anything that felt like a weapon. The wolves watched her do it and made sounds that might have been laughter, might have been words in that same chanting language she'd heard at the stone circle. Then one of them did something impossible. It stood up on its hind legs, reached up with its front paws, and pulled. The wolf's skin split down the middle like a costume. Underneath was a human figure, naked, emaciated, covered in scars and symbols carved into its flesh. The figure's face was wrong, features blurred and indistinct, but its eyes were sharp and focused and utterly malevolent. It spoke in Lisa's voice. "You came to find her. You want to know what happened. I'll show you." The figure pointed back toward the trees. Lisa looked and saw something hanging from a branch. A body. Sophia Carr's body, or what was left of it. She'd been suspended upside down, her skin removed in careful strips, her body positioned like the offerings at the stone circle. Lisa turned and vomited. When she looked up, all 3 wolves had shed their skins and were walking toward her as humans that weren't humans, moving with that same synchronized precision. Their faces kept shifting, sometimes Sophia's features, sometimes Lisa's own face, sometimes something else entirely. The center figure spoke, and this time its voice was its own, ancient, dry, full of hunger. "Ye Nald Lushi. You have no word for what we are. Skinwalkers, your legends call us. Witches who broke the greatest taboos to gain the greatest powers. We wear the skins of animals and the names of the dead. We consume identities the way you consume food. What do you want?" Lisa forced the words out. "What we have always wanted. To hunt. To feed. To persist." The figure gestured at the landscape around them. "This land remembers when we walked freely, when we were feared, when offerings were made to keep us satisfied. Then your people came with their parks and their rangers and their belief that nature could be managed, controlled, made safe. but some things cannot be managed. Sophia Carr, Lisa said. Why her? She found our place. She documented it, photographed it, planned to tell others. We could not allow that. So she became an offering, a warning, a meal. The figure's face shifted to Sophia's exact features. And now you've found it too. Lisa's mind raced. 16 years of experience, 16 years of crisis response training, all of it screaming at her to stay calm, think tactically, find a solution. She looked at her surroundings. Open hillside, no shelter, no weapons, no help coming. Her radio was dead. Her GPS showed her position but couldn't call for rescue. The nearest other humans were miles away. She was alone with 3 shape-shifting predators who could move faster than she could run and apparently consume people's identities. But they were talking. They hadn't killed her immediately. That meant they wanted something. You want me to keep quiet, Lisa said. About the site, about what you are. The figures glanced at each other. When they turned back, all 3 wore Lisa's face. We want you to understand. Your colleagues will search for you. They will find your truck, your equipment, your notes about abnormal wolf behavior. They will search and eventually conclude that you vanished, like so many others have vanished in Yellowstone's history. Another ranger lost to the wilderness. And if I agree, if I keep quiet, then we might let you live. We might even return the Carr girl's remains for proper burial. We are not without mercy. The center figure stepped closer. But you would carry us with you. Part of us would live in you, in your memories, in your dreams. You would never be quite certain what was real and what we showed you. You would never be quite yourself again. Lisa looked at the 3 identical versions of herself, all wearing her face with an expression she'd never made. Hungry, predatory, ancient. She thought about Sophia Carr, 23 years old, researching Native American history, who'd found something she shouldn't have found and paid for it with her life. She thought about 16 years of service, of believing she understood this wilderness, of confidence built on experience that was now revealed as arrogance. She thought about the wolves eating in formation, about the tracks that changed species mid-stride, about her own voice coming from a wolf's mouth. And she made a decision. No. The figures tilted their heads in unison, curious. No. No deal. Lisa pulled out her camera. You're right that my colleagues will search for me, and they'll find my documentation. All my photos of the stone circle, the tracks, the offerings, I uploaded them to the park database before I followed Sophia's trail. If I don't check in by sunset, protocol requires them to investigate my last known position. It was a bluff. She hadn't uploaded anything, but the figures didn't need to know that. They'll find the site, Lisa continued. They'll investigate. They'll bring in experts. Maybe they won't believe in skinwalkers, but they'll document everything. Your hiding place will become a tourist attraction, a historical landmark, a subject of study. You'll have researchers, park rangers, tourists crawling all over it. Is that what you want? The figures stopped moving. Their faces rippled, Lisa's features melting away to reveal something underneath. Not human, not animal. Something in between that hurt to look at directly. You're clever, one of them said. Clever enough to lie, to buy time, to hope rescue comes. But there is no rescue. Your radio is dead. Your GPS will fail. Your colleagues will search in the wrong places because we will lead them there. We are patient. We have waited decades. We can wait a few more days. Maybe, Lisa said, but you're making a mistake. What mistake? You're assuming I came out here alone. She hadn't. That was another lie. But she said it with enough confidence, enough certainty, that the figures hesitated. They glanced at each other, some wordless communication passing between them. You're bluffing, one said, but it didn't sound certain. Lisa pressed her advantage. I've been a ranger for 16 years. I've seen veteran rangers die because they worked alone, got overconfident, thought they knew better than protocol. I always work with a partner in remote areas. Always. He's about a mile south, checking another sector. We radio each other every 30 minutes. I missed the last check-in. He's already hiking this direction. More silence. The figures were completely still now, frozen in a way that was more unsettling than their movement. Then one of them laughed, a sound like bones breaking. 16 years, and you've learned to lie like us. Perhaps there is more of the witch in you than you realize. The figures began backing away, their bodies shifting and flowing. In seconds they were wolves again, gray and lean and deadly. But their eyes remained human, fixed on Lisa with an expression she couldn't read. "We will not forget you, Lisa Hoffman," one of them said in her voice. "You carry our attention now. You carry our interest. This is not mercy. This is a promise." Then they were gone, melting into the landscape so quickly and completely that Lisa couldn't track their movement. She stood alone on the hillside, breathing hard, waiting for them to return. Minutes passed. The sun crossed the sky. Birds began singing again. She hadn't noticed when they'd stopped. The normal sounds of Yellowstone resumed, as if nothing had happened. Lisa waited another hour before she trusted herself to move. Her legs shook as she hiked back towards Sophia Carr's campsite, taking a different route, moving through open ground where she could see in all directions. Every shadow made her flinch. Every bird call made her reach for the bear spray that would be useless against what she'd seen. She reached the campsite at sunset. Her original radio was still there, lying where she'd dropped it. She picked it up, tried the power button, and was shocked when it actually turned on. "Chen, this is Hoffman. Do you copy?" Static, then Chen's voice, annoyed. "Jesus, Hoffman, where have you been? You missed 3 check-ins. I've got a search team mobilizing. Stand down the team. I'm code 4. She took a breath. "But we need to close the Specimen Ridge area to hikers, immediately. I found evidence of Carr's presence but no sign of her alive. Terrain is dangerous, possibly structurally unstable. I'm recommending we bring in a full SAR operation at first light with ground-penetrating radar." "Copy that. You okay? You sound rattled." Lisa looked at the journal still lying in Sophia Carr's tent. She thought about the stone circle, the offerings, the impossible tracks. She thought about 3 figures wearing her face, 3 wolves that walked like humans, 3 voices that spoke in prophecy and threat. "I'm fine," she said. "Just tired. Heading back to the truck now." "Copy. Get some rest, Hoffman. We'll brief the SAR team in the morning." Lisa gathered her equipment and hiked back to her truck, taking main trails, staying in open areas, moving fast despite her exhaustion. She reached her vehicle 2 hours after dark and sat in the cab with all the doors locked, windows up, checking and rechecking that nothing had followed her. Her camera was still in her pack. She pulled it out and reviewed the photos she'd taken at the stone circle. Every single one was corrupted, white light obscuring the stones, digital artifacts making the images unreadable. The photos of the tracks, the campsite, the journal entries, all corrupted. The only clear photos were the ones she'd taken before reaching the circle. Lisa deleted them all, every single one. Then she reformatted the memory card, destroying any possibility of recovery. She filed her report the next morning. Missing hiker, evidence of campsite, no signs of foul play, possible fall or animal attack. The SAR team searched for 3 days and found nothing. No body, no equipment, no further traces. Sophia Carr was officially listed as missing, presumed dead due to environmental exposure. Lisa didn't mention the stone circle, didn't mention the offerings, the tracks, the figures. She'd learned in 16 years that some things couldn't be explained in official reports without damaging your credibility, your career, your future. But she requested a transfer. Not immediately. That would raise questions. She waited 6 months, applied for a position at Acadia National Park in Maine, as far from Yellowstone as she could get while staying with the Park Service. She cited burnout, need for change, family considerations. Her transfer was approved. She left Yellowstone in March 2008, and she never went back. But the dreams followed her. Dreams of wolves walking upright, of figures wearing her face, of voices speaking in languages she didn't know but somehow understood. Dreams of Sophia Carr hanging from a tree, not dead but sleeping, waiting for someone to cut her down. And sometimes in crowds or in mirrors or in photographs, Lisa would see her own face, but wrong. Eyes too sharp, smile too wide, expression too hungry. And she would remember the promise, "You carry our attention now." She never spoke about what happened at Yellowstone. Not to colleagues, not to friends, not to the therapist she saw after the nightmares got too bad. She carried the knowledge alone, the way she suspected others had carried it before her, the way others would carry it after. Because that was the thing about Yellowstone, about any wilderness this old and vast and deep. It kept secrets. It protected certain truths because those truths were too dangerous to acknowledge. And if you were smart, if you valued your sanity and your life, you learned to keep those secrets too. Lisa Hoffman worked at Acadia for 3 more years before leaving the Park Service entirely. She moved to Boston, got a job in environmental consulting, married a man who knew nothing about her past, except that she'd once been a ranger. She had a daughter, bought a house, built a normal life, but she never went camping, never hiked alone, never visited any national parks, not even the safe ones, the popular ones, the ones with paved trails and visitor centers and rangers who believed the wilderness could be controlled, because she knew better now. She knew that some places remembered older laws than the ones humans wrote. She knew that some things lived in the spaces between civilization and wildness, wearing skins that weren't their own, speaking names they'd consumed. And she knew that they kept their promises. On her daughter's 5th birthday, Lisa received a package with no return address. Inside was a single item, a small bundle of wildflowers tied with red thread, the same kind of offering she'd seen at the stone circle in Yellowstone. The flowers were fresh, as if just picked. Lisa burned them in the kitchen sink, then scattered the ashes in running water according to instructions she didn't remember learning. She never received another package, but she knew they were watching, would always be watching, because that's what it meant to carry their attention, to be marked, to be remembered by things that existed before memory itself. The wilderness had taught Lisa Hoffman its final lesson. There are beings that cannot be managed, controlled, or explained. There are only 2 choices when you encounter them: die or survive. And if you survive, you carry them with you forever. She chose to survive. She chose to carry them. And she never, ever spoke their name aloud again. The stone circle at Specimen Ridge was never found by subsequent investigations. The coordinates Lisa had recorded led to empty hillside. No rocks, no offerings, no signs of habitation. Some researchers suggested Lisa had been mistaken about the location. Others suggested she'd experienced environmental stress-induced hallucination. Lisa never corrected them. She let them believe what they needed to believe, because the alternative was worse than ignorance. The alternative was knowledge that would drive you to the same places, the same circles, the same offerings. Knowledge that would make you see wolves walking upright in your peripheral vision. Knowledge that would make you question every voice you heard, every face you saw, every moment of certainty you'd ever had. Lisa chose ignorance for everyone else, and for herself, she chose silence. The wilderness kept its secrets, Lisa kept hers, and the Yinaldlushi kept walking, kept hunting, kept wearing the skins and names of those who ventured too deep into places that predated human understanding. Yellowstone remained beautiful, vast, and deadly. Tourists came and went, saw wildlife, took photos, left satisfied. Rangers patrolled the trails, managed the resources, believed they understood their domain. And deep in the backcountry, in places marked on no map, maintained by no official body, the old circles remained. The offerings accumulated. The skins were worn and shed and worn again. And if you listened carefully, if you knew what to listen for, you could hear singing in the wind. Low, rhythmic chanting in a language older than English, older than Navajo, older than any human tongue. The song of those who walked in skins not their own. The song of hunger that never sleeps. The song of wilderness that will never be tamed. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.